peace is obtained when you achieve parity. So there was a parity that was obtained in 67, got back India's pride. 67 also laid down the template for India in terms of dealing with China. My book talks about 1967 being the watershed year. And the watershed year is in two respects, and this is one of the reasons why 67 is important, is that it happened on the watershed, which is the physical geographical boundary between India and China. Secondly, it's also a watershed year in terms of the historical narrative that flowed thereafter, because from 67 onwards, up until now, India and China have never had a single military confrontation. There has been one incident of firing in 1975, but that aside, there's been no hostilities in terms of battles. They never went up in a battle against each other. 67 also laid down the template for India in terms of dealing with China. So when you look at 1971, China didn't interfere in the India-Pakistan war. Not many have asked that question as to why. There are very, very many reasons, but 67 is an important yet underrated reason why China did not really go down the Siliguri corridor and cut India out. Thereafter, at various standoffs, whether it is Daulat Beg Uldi or Doklam in 2017, India has always, used that template and obtained a dominating position in standoffs against China. So I think that is something that has set the template, and that has also ensured, which is what I maintain, that peace is obtained when you achieve parity. So there was a parity that was obtained in 67, got back India's pride, was also responsible in conveying to China that yes, they are, it's a bigger power, militarily so, but it could not overrun India anymore. As India was going up against Pakistan on the Western Front, Chinese troops had amassed across the border near Sikkim. And, that was the time when, it was expected that Indian troops would pull back from Nathula, which General Sagat refused to do so. And he refused to do so because that would give the Chinese easy access to the Siliguri corridor down the Sikkim axis. So he disagreed with his superiors, and he stuck to his decision. Now, why would we want to contextualize it is, remember it was 1965, 3 years earlier, India had suffered heavy setbacks. So psychologically, the political leadership was rattled and was even, it was quite demoralized in 1962 as far as China was concerned. We had achieved some success against Pakistan in 1965. However, the overall attitude towards China was still very much different, very much defensive. So going against the grain of leadership was something that was extremely creditable of General Sagat at that point of time. His decision helped Indian troops to sort of stay there in Nathula and ward off any kind of Chinese presence. Otherwise, the Chinese troops would have captured Nathula. And then during the 1971 war, they would have had easy access to the Siliguri corridor. 1962 is perhaps a blessing in disguise that, we had until then, and please remember it was 15 years after our independence, so we were still getting up there and trying to put together the right kind of political and military leadership, especially, which we hadn't had at that point of time in 1962. So the overall of the leadership was one of the major factors. Some of the military leaders who played a significant part in 1965, 67, and then later on in 1971 were not a part of the 1962 war. For instance, General Sam Manekshaw wasn't around, General Sagat wasn't around. It was an era when India had suffered reverses a few years before that. 5 years before that, in 1962, in an Indo-China war, India had suffered a heavy setback. So when this happened, it wasn't covered as much in the media, and people didn't really couldn't quite come to terms with what had happened there. That was one part. It wasn't highlighted as much. Secondly, it was also India and China had kind of not wanted to play it up much. So I think there was tacitly, it was agreed to not really play it up in the international fora. Thirdly, and the most important reason was in 1971, India had registered a resounding victory, which kind of whitewashed a lot of things that had happened in the past. So it's been a journey which took me to, say for instance, a village in Lamahata near Darjeeling, or somewhere in Sikkim, or took me to a prince's estate somewhere because somebody was a former general, took me to meet certain people in certain parts of the country where people had settled. So a lot of this came from primary sources. It also came from declassified accounts of the US government, for instance, because the book also travels into 1971 and beyond. So some of these inputs did come from declassified accounts, given that we don't have an official history of that period. The impact of not having it done is that it denies scholars, historians, and your countrymen to know about your history, and of course military officers and generals and others to learn from your mistakes, to savor your victories. The one thing that has happened in the past, if I were to give you an example, is that for instance, if you don't write your history, somebody else will. The history of 1962 was written by Brigadier John Dalby, who was the commander of the 7th Brigade, which was defeated by, which is one of the first Indian formations brigades to be defeated by the Chinese forces. And Brigadier Dalby was taken a prisoner, and he was kept in China for some time. After he came back, he wrote this book. It was bitter. It was quite explosive. But the book, what did we do? We banned the book. Thereafter, Neville Maxwell wrote a book on India and China. It was sympathetic to China. What happened with that? When Henry Kissinger went to China in 1970-71, he visited Beijing and he met Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai gave him that book as a gift. Henry Kissinger's drift on China in his entire anti-Indian narrative was also based heavily from around his learnings from the book, which he found to be extremely impressive. So this is what history does. History does shape a narrative.